In this video, I'm going to walk through exactly what happens when a bond is claimed. This is for property investors who have always been wondering how the bond process works. From a property investor perspective, I find many property owners always feel that the bond process is mysterious or secret, and it's not. The only reason why you feel that way is most likely because somebody wants you to feel that way because they're hiding something from you. So I'm going to walk through the exact steps and common misconceptions that all property investors have when it comes to the bond process. Okay, here on my screen I have the refund of the rental bond process from the RTA. This is a diagram that's available online from the RTA directly, and this is exactly how they work. It begins by a Form 4 or an online refund request for the rental bond of that property. The tenant or the property manager can claim the bond. It's not only the property manager and it's not only the tenant. When the RTA receives this form or request for a refund of the rental bond, there are two steps right from the beginning. Number one is the form that is received is not signed by all parties to the bond. This happens when, say for example, the tenant claims the full bond and we as a property manager says, no, you're in $1,000 rental arrears. Therefore, you cannot have the full bond. That is what happens in that situation. The other option is the form is signed by the tenant and the agent agreeing how the bond should be paid. This means that the vacate has been finalized, the agent inspection has been completed, and let's say there's a $300 water bill outstanding, and the tenant says, hey, take the $300 from my bond, can I have the rest? And as there's no other outstanding issues, the property manager says, yes, that's no problem. Both the property manager and the tenant agree on how the bond should be distributed, and it goes all the way down here, and the RTA pays out the bond as directed. So the RTA can only pay out the bond if both parties, the property manager and the tenant, agree. They cannot pay out the bond if both parties do not agree. However, there is one exception to that. Let's say the form is received and the tenant claims a full bond and we say, no, you need to pay $1,000 in rental arrears. Well, the RTA sends a notice of claim to the parties who did not sign the form. This means if the tenant claimed the bond and we did not agree to that, or we did not respond to that request in the 48-hour period that the RTA gives once the bond is claimed, it sends a notice of claim period. From there, we have two options. We can agree with the claim and sign the notice. Let's say, for example, we say to the tenant, we can't refund the bond until you pay these arrears. Everything else is fine. The tenant pays the arrears and we're happy. This allows us, as we have fulfilled our obligations, secured all funds on behalf of the owner, we will sign that notice, and then it goes down to the bottom, the RTA pays out the full bond to the tenant because the tenant resolved the arrears. The other option is the other party does not respond to the claim within 14 days. This is the one exception that I was talking about. If the tenant did not agree within that first period that the RTA gives, and we do not sign the notice of claim because the RTA received no response from the property manager within those 14 days, which is 2 weeks, which is a very long time, because the bond has been claimed, the RTA pays out that full bond to that tenant, which is a very dangerous thing, because if an email is missed, or if for some reason the property manager is still finalizing the bond, there's only 14 days to dispute that claim, otherwise that full bond gets refunded to the tenant. However, the vice versa, if we claim that full bond as a property manager, the tenant doesn't respond to that claim, we get that full bond. So it works both ways. Let's say that the RTA sends a notice of claim, and let's say that the tenant claimed that full bond, they were in $1,000 rental arrears, they did not resolve the rental arrears, so we lodged a claim against that request. And that is a dispute resolution request, Form 16, and we lodged that with the RTA before that due date. From there, the conciliator from the RTA helps the parties negotiate an agreement. The interesting thing is, you're looking at least 14 days after that bond was claimed. So if the tenant vacated, for example, the 1st of June, you're probably not even going to get to a mediation call with a conciliator from the RTA until late June, which means any funds you were looking at getting to cover the costs of, for example, a clean or rental arrears, you're going to be waiting and waiting and waiting. So keep in mind that most bond processes, once they go to a dispute resolution request, at least take probably a month. And in our experience at the moment, the RTA is extremely busy. They too have to run a business, if you will, and only have a certain amount of staff. And I was talking to one of the RTA guys the other day, and they said they are swamped with dispute resolution requests. So we had lodged a dispute resolution request a month prior, and only a few days ago did we get a time to hop on a mediation call with the conciliator and the tenant. I personally don't complain because I know how difficult it is to mediate and try and get a good outcome for both the tenant and the property manager. So I'm not going to complain, but that's something to keep in mind because you should not be relying on the bond to cover costs for cleaning or rental arrears or maintenance to get the property relet. If you do decide to operate that way, there's going to be a long time that the property is going to sit vacant because you're waiting on funds to get the clean done or to get the maintenance completed. From there, the conciliator from the RTA helps the parties negotiate an agreement. Now, the thing is, they can't push for an agreement. They are not siding on the property manager's side or the tenant's side as much as people like to think they are. From my experience, the RTA has actually been very professional and well-spoken across the board and quite helpful. The thing to remember is that they're also not a magistrate. They do not have the power to refund a bond. They are simply trying to help the tenant and the property manager come to a resolution without going to court. If we do go to a dispute resolution, I always hope that it is successful. The thing is, it is a negotiation, and both the tenant and, in my opinion, the RTA expect you to negotiate, which means countering and making an offer that isn't what you're wanting. So if you were going into a negotiation wanting the full bond, you may have to come down a little bit to get a successful resolution, which is why you want to deal with it way before this, so you're not having to go through this entire process. This dispute resolution process I try to avoid, and I think of it as a last resort. We don't want to rely on this. We want to try and sort it out with the tenant earlier so there's no issues and the bond can be refunded a lot sooner than this. Let's say that it is unsuccessful. The tenant says, well, I'm not paying $1,000 rent. And we say, well, you have to pay $1,000 rent because it is rent and you are obligated to pay it. The mediator cannot do anything. So they mark it as an unsuccessful resolution, and the RTA issues a notice of unresolved dispute. What this means is that whoever disputed the request has 7 days to lodge a QCAT application. I'm calling it QCAT because we work in Queensland. If it's New South Wales, it's going to be a slightly different name. Same as Western Australia, etc. The tiny thing to note here is if you are going against a dispute because, say for example, the tenant claimed the bond, it puts the ball in your court, which means you have to pay probably around $100 to $200 to lodge the court application, and you're probably going to incur additional costs from your property manager to prep that court case. For court cases that I have done, which we don't do them very often, but we do have to do them from time to time, I spend at least 10 hours per case because the case is one in the preparation. I'm no lawyer, but that's my opinion, and it seems to have worked pretty well so far. The other interesting thing is, let's say we claimed the bond in this instance. It went through the dispute resolution request and it was unsuccessful with the mediation. The tenant now has 7 days to lodge that application to the QCAT. If they don't lodge that application, the bond is refunded as directed. So if we claim the full bond in the instance, and the tenant did not issue and lodge a application with the court within 7 days of the decision being made from the mediator at the RTA, we're going to get the full bond. But if the tenant does dispute the request and lodge a tort application, it goes to the tribunal for a due date for the hearing, and then you go to the court with the magistrate and they make a decision on how the bond should be directed. And again here, you're probably going to be looking at negotiating some sort of funds and not going to get the funds that you were originally hoping for. So that there is the entire walkthrough of how the RTA works once the bond is claimed to be refunded, either by the property manager or the tenant. It still applies. A few notes here is that the bond equates to 4 weeks rent. That is a maximum that any property manager can request, and we want to make sure we look after properties, so we want 4 weeks rent. A key thing to remember is that the bond is held by the RTA. Your property manager does not hold that bond. The tenant or the property manager can claim the bond immediately after they vacate, which means if you vacated on the 3rd of May, you can claim it immediately after you vacate and get in early, which you may have to do depending on the circumstance. I try to avoid that and leave the bond till last and sort out anything with the tenant, providing they are reasonable and happy to work with us to come to a conclusion, and then we finalise the bond after that. The other thing is, if the property manager claims the bond, we need quotes/invoices within 14 days of that claim. But the tenant does not need to do that. So as soon as we claim that bond, it's important to get contractors out there, and I would recommend if the property is messy and needs to be cleaned, get it cleaned anyway, because you're going to have to release it. There's no point sitting around and waiting for funds. There are numerous categories for a bond claim. You can claim for water usage, cleaning, damages, lawn maintenance, rental arrears, you name it. These things here are the main categories we see when we are claiming a bond. And the last one that is most important is that if it goes to court, it is considered a non-urgent application. And that means you'll be waiting for at least a month before the hearing date is scheduled. Thankfully, in the Emerald region, we don't have as much court cases and as much demand as the city, so we normally get in around a month, 2 months in. But I know in the city, you're going to be looking at a few months possibly before that hearing date is scheduled. From there, the tenant can cancel and reschedule it for a month later. So again, the most important thing to take away from this is if the bond has been claimed and you are going through a bond negotiation, there's no point waiting for the bond. Get it leased again, which means getting the property clean, doing any maintenance, and securing a new quality tenant. That is the best thing you can do to make sure you continue to receive rental income despite having this issue with a few $1,000s in dispute. And then when you do get that bond, you may not get as much as you wanted. So there you can go through your landlord insurance, and I would recommend allocating the bond to invoices first, because rental arrears are easier to claim from the insurance side than a cleaning or handyman invoice. I hope that helps. Something that I try to do right from the get-go to avoid all of this happening and to avoid all of this chaos and disruption happening with your investment property is simply securing a quality tenant to begin with, because they're going to be easier to reason with and more likely to pay their rent on time. Make sure the property is clean when they move in. Don't move tenants into a dirty property, because they're going to be resentful when they move out. And last but not least, make sure you keep on top of your maintenance. If you don't service the air cons and they're always leaking, or there's constantly these minor maintenance issues that are going on that the tenant is really requesting to be completed, and it's always taking so long because you don't want to do them, or you're wanting to compare 5 different quotes, the tenant is going to be resentful, which means when they vacate, they're going to be more difficult to deal with than if maintenance was resolved quickly and swiftly. I totally understand that sometimes you can't do every single maintenance item, but make sure that the necessary maintenance items are resolved within a reasonable time frame. Make sure the property is clean when they move in, and secure a quality tenant. And then hopefully you won't have to go through all of this.